Okay, I think I will just introduce and then start today's seminar. Welcome everyone to come to this week's seminar. And today we have Anna Gülcher from, who is a PhD student from ETH Zürich, Switzerland. Sorry, there are two more people. Anna obtained her bachelor degree in 2016. And soon after that, she obtained her master degree in geophysics at ETH Zürich. And now she's a second year or soon to be a third year PhD student working on the composition and the dynamics of deep Earth and their application to understanding planetary evolution in the solar system. Let's welcome Anna to give us her talk.
Thank you very much for this introduction. And I also really want to thank you for inviting me to give this talk here today. I'm quite excited to show our latest results with you. And I'm going to start sharing my screen soon. Let me check. Yes. So in case anything is incorrect, let me know. I hope you can see my title page. So today I'm gonna talk to you about evidence for widespread ongoing plume activity on Venus, close from Coronae morphologies. And this project is actually, this was my master thesis project that I already started over 2.5 years ago. And I worked still on it a little bit during my PhD. That's why it was quite a long road, but we're happy to get here. And my co-supervisors of this project are listed here below, or here in the middle and illustrated here below. Taras Gülcher, who is a professor in geodynamics here at ETH, and Laurent Montesi, who is obviously a professor in planetary sciences at yours. And Jessica Munch, who is a PhD student here at ETH and provided me a lot of help with the technical sides of this study. So today I'm going to talk about research that has recently been published. We published this about 2 months ago in Nature Geoscience. The article is here shown on the left. And everything that I will show here today is also described in this paper. And I've also written a behind the paper blog post for the nature astronomy community. So if after this talk something remains unclear or you would like to read more about it, please have a look at either of these articles. And the talk I'm going to give is kind of divided into 3 parts. The first part is obviously an introductory part. I'll introduce how we obtain data from Venus and what it revealed. And obviously I'll have a look, or I'll describe to you these mysterious corona structures, of which some photos are already, or images are already shown here. Then after this introduction, I'll describe our 3D numerical modeling study that we did to try to assess these mysterious structures. So these are images that you will see coming back in this talk. And then finally, I hope to convince you that we were able to use this 3D numerical modeling study to map out ongoing plume activity on the planet. And those are the images that you'll see at the end of my presentation. So just about Venus, this is a schematic image of our solar system with our world being located here. And Venus is our neighboring planet, which is slightly closer to the sun. And Venus received a lot of attention in space exploration several decades ago already, as space exploration of Venus started around the 1960s and 70s, which is about 50 to 60 years ago, which I'm always very impressed by. And some of the most important missions I've shown here on the right side. And in fact, the Soviet Union, now Russia, they were the first to visit Venus with the Venera spacecraft, here shown on the top. And this was from the 1960s to the 1980s. And the Venera spacecrafts were basically, they sent out altogether, I think, 16 spacecraft to Venus. Some failed, some succeeded in entering the Venusian atmosphere. About 13 out of 16 entered the Venusian atmosphere, and 10 successfully landed on the planet. But Venus has extreme surface conditions. There are very high temperatures on the planet, and I'll get back to that also in a second. And the atmosphere has extreme pressures, much, much higher than on Earth. So a lot of these spacecrafts could only survive for a very short period of time before they were destroyed. And I'm just going to give a very quick history because I always find it so impressive what they could do over 50 years ago. The very first mission attempt to Venus was this Venera 1, which looked like this, and this was in 1966. Launching the spacecraft was successful, but just before it was flying past Venus, it lost radio contact with the Earth, and this resulted in no data or no returning data anymore to Earth. And scientists said that this mission failed due to the overheating of this spacecraft. But the very first successful landing on Venus was by this Venera 7 mission in 1970. So soon it will have its 50th birthday. This spacecraft here illustrated remained in contact with the Earth while it was on the surface of Venus for about 20 minutes before it was destroyed by these surface temperatures. These temperatures can reach 470 Celsius degrees. And the atmospheric pressure on Venus is about 90 times as that on Earth. So you can imagine that the atmospheric pressure when you're on the surface of Venus is the same as we would be swimming 900 meters underwater. So that's quite hostile. The very first images that were returned to Earth about the surface of Venus came from the Venera 9 in 1975. And these instruments revealed these images, and you can see a sort of semi-smooth surface with numerous blocks. But the most successful Venera spacecraft was the following, the 13. This landed on Venus, and here on the left side you see the lander. And this was in 1981, and this spacecraft sent the first imaged colors back to Earth and also analyzed soil samples from the surface. This impressive spacecraft operated for a record time of 2 hours on the surface. And this was considered a huge success because it was actually designed to only last for about 30 minutes before being cooked or crushed by its environment. And actually, since the Venera spacecraft, or since 1984, there hasn't been any landers on Venus. And those images that this Venera 13 sent back look like this. And there's another colorized image that looks like this. And what you can mainly see here is that the surface where it landed mainly consists of smooth plains, and the soil analysis came back, and that indicated that the composition of this material is mainly like basalt we have on Earth, like oceanic crust. What I consider perhaps also one of the most important missions is the Magellan missions. This was operated by NASA in the early 1990s. And this proved to be very important for planetary geologists and geophysicists because it provided us a near global data set of imagery of the surface, of altimetry and radiometry. And about 98% of the surface was mapped by this Magellan mission. And this also resulted in like Venus science to burst full of activity in the 1990s because there was so much to figure out with all of this new exciting data. So since then, it got quite quiet concerning Venus science in particular, or spacecraft space exploration, because I think terrestrial planet science exploration has really focused on other planets, like maybe a bit less hostile, like our other neighbor Mars. There have been some exciting recent missions like the Venus Express, which was done by the European Space Agency, and the Japanese mission Akatsuki. But both of these missions are mostly concentrated on the atmosphere and the climate of Venus, which is also very interesting. But for me as a geodynamicist, we mainly still rely on Magellan data, which is now about 25 years ago that this data was obtained. Anyway, data from these various missions revealed that in many ways, Earth and Venus are very similar. They are often called twin planets, since they have a similar size, a similar mass. They found a similar bulk composition, potentially the internal structure, and the gravity is roughly similar. However, there are also profound differences between the two, and I will just highlight, for me, the most important ones. I already mentioned that the surface temperatures of Venus are extremely hot. It can be close to 500 degrees Celsius. It's generally thought that Venus is very dry compared to Earth, with water depleted or only very minor water being present. And most importantly, at least very interestingly, there is no apparent mosaic of moving plates on the surface, like we have on Earth, being plate tectonics. This mainly came out of the observation, out of the observation that, in contrast to Earth, where the crustal age over the whole planet is very variable, on Venus, the surface seems to be quite uniform and very young, being about 500 million years. And this they have studied using looking at the distribution of impact craters on the surface of Venus. And such an apparent young surface age also implies like a uniform surface age implies that there is no big resurfacing going on. So when this was found out several decades ago, people came with the hypothesis that on Venus, there must be some catastrophic resurfacing going on, meaning that about 500 million years ago, there must have been a global resurfacing event, like a burst of activity in which all of the surface material was recycled and newly produced. And since then, there has been very little activity on the planet. And this was quite well accepted. But more recently, in the recent years, there have been studies showing that the same kind of crater distribution among the planet of Venus could also be explained by more equilibrium resurfacing, which means that there are ongoing small regional resurfacing processes going on continuously. So these are basically the two main hypotheses out there of geological activity on Venus. So let's focus on the Venusian surface. As I said, it's considered mostly basaltic in composition. And despite the absence of plate tectonics, there actually are a lot of volcanic and tectonic structures on its surface. And this I always find very nicely illustrated in this colorized topographic mosaic, which is made out of the Magellan imagery of the surface of Venus. And as you can see, the surface of Venus has still a lot of structures. You see sort of higher regions, highlands, you see linear zones where a lot seems to be going on, a lot of circular areas. And all of these structures are commonly attributed to underlying mantle convective processes, as surface strains and displacements seem to be quite modest. So I'm just going to show the view of those, if it loads, a few of those structures that are abundant on the surface. So the Venusian surface hosts pancake domes, which are illustrated here, kind of mountain terrains, of which illustrations are shown here on the right. But we also have suggestive rifting areas, a lot of shield volcanoes, and the more unique nova structures here shown in this image, and of course the corona structures, which I will get back to very shortly. And a key question remains to what extent these surface structures reflect the current interior state of Venus and whether Venus is geologically active today. And again, this goes back to those two main line of thoughts out there that I've mentioned before, being catastrophic or equilibrium resurfacing. So while the catastrophic event was generally well accepted, also quite some newer, exciting papers actually proposed individual site of present-day volcanism and magnetism on Venus with various means of techniques. So recent hotspot volcanism identified, renewed magmatic activity, present-day volcanism, and this is just a part of some more papers out there. And with our research, we actually propose that these mysterious corona structures can be used to bear testimony for ongoing turbulent processes in Venus's interior, with which we build up on this line of thought of present-day activity on Venus. So what are corona? Corona are these large circular structures, and corona actually mean crowns in Latin. And these structures are associated with volcanism and tectonics, as volcanism is highly evident, and there's a lot of faulting structures, being these concentric radial structures. And there are several hundreds of them all over the surface. And they also exist in a variety of forms, being from 60 to over 1,000 kilometers wide. And I just want to emphasize here that these structures are really large. So unfortunately, I just have a European example, but for example, this corona here in the middle has a diameter of about 400 kilometers. And this is like, this whole structure is much larger than the country I currently live in. And I just realized, I think just an hour ago, that kilometers is, I'm not sure if that's used in America or in the US, sorry. So I tried to convert this to miles. So this is from 40 to over 600 miles. I'm not sure. I hope you use miles. I'm not sure. Anyway, these are very large structures, and these are structures we do not see on Earth like we see on Venus. And this is very puzzling. And these structures also exist in a large range of morphologies. So here is a table from this paper of 20 years ago showing all the several topographic profiles that that the corona on Venus, several hundreds of them show. So some of them have this kind of domal shape or plateau shape, and the lines here indicates where the main area of faulting is. But they can also be more complex with an outer rise and a trench, and then again an inner elevated interior. So there's a large variety in their shapes. They are commonly understood to form as a response to crustal stresses developed above an upwelling mantle plume, followed by possible gravitational relaxation. And several studies have identified individual corona that exhibit structures at their margin that are indicative for retreating subduction or even lithospheric delamination at the margins of those large corona structures. And in our paper, we describe several older hypotheses of corona formation, but mainly the plume-lithosphere interaction models are very dominant as they describe as they are able to explain key features of corona, being their topographic reliefs, their faulting, and the magnetism observed. And previous numerical modeling of such plume-lithosphere interactions and corona formation are quite limited. This is in terms of their dimensions. A lot of them are only in 2D or in very small sizes, but also like the sophistication of numerical implementations of, for example, volcanism. And also most of the papers or most of the studies that are out there focus on only one certain shape of corona, while there, as I described, there's a whole bunch of morphologies out there. So the aim of our study was to use sophisticated 3D numerical models of plume-lithosphere interactions on Venus to assess the formation of corona structures and the reason behind their morphological diversity. So that's what we set out to do with my master thesis. So for these 3D models, we used the thermal mechanical code I3 Alphys, which was developed by Tagaskeria here at ETH. And I just want to mention a few specifics to make the geodynamicists happy. This is a 3D geodynamic code that uses a finite difference method applied on a staggered crit and marker incel technique. It solves for mass, momentum, and energy conservation. And importantly, it includes a simplified implementation of melting behavior, crustal accretion, and phase changes. And we assume a viscoplastic rheology, which includes strain weakening of material, and as well as local melt-induced weakening of lithospheric material. So that's all about the techniques. If you have questions, feel free to ask. And here on the right, I show the numerical setup of our models. Basically, we place a buoyant mantle plume, here shown in the orange color in the composition profile, underneath a warm basaltic crust. And the crust is here shown in green. And the temperature profile is shown here below. And so this plume is basically made hotter than its surroundings. Our whole model box is quite large, like 2,000 by 2,000 by 400 kilometers. And this is resolved by over 250 million markers. And these models really take quite some time to run. And we have run 21 of them. And these models were varied in terms of plume buoyancy, which I mainly indicate by plume temperature or plume size. But we also varied the lithospheric configuration in many of these models, being the lithospheric strength or the crustal thickness. And I will get back to these parameters when we look at the results. So I will now show the evolution of the reference model, which is exactly the setup that was shown in the slide earlier. And what we'll have a look, I illustrate these models as a cross-section through the middle of the model, showing the composition in all of these bright colors. So plume material is orange and red, and the crust, the initially basaltic crust, is green. So that's good to remember. And the newly formed volcanic or magnetic crust is shown here in the orange, in the pink colors. And then this top view shows the surface topography, of which the axis is shown here. So after the onset of model evolution, the buoyant mantle plume rises and breaks up the lithosphere and penetrates through it. The crust and lithosphere are pushed aside by this mantle plume. And what you can see as a surface response is that the interior of the corona structure is elevated, and it's surrounded by a trench and a slightly outer rise. Then as time progresses, the plume material pushes the lithospheric material to the sides as the plume widens. And at the plume margins, this crustal material that is pushed aside is dripping into the mantle. This is a relatively weak material, so it detaches and drips into the mantle, and this can be with several episodes. Again, the surface topography is indicated by a deep trench that is located above this downwelling material. And the interior of the corona is still elevated, but it's lost its elevation compared to the very initial state of our model. Then, after enough time has passed, the plume has cooled down and fully recrystallized, as you can see here. And the surface topography here is marked by an elevated rim. And this elevated rim is located exactly above these regions where initially material was dripping downward, but what is left behind is a thickened crust. And the interior of the corona is a depressed region. And this depressed region is located above the material, the area where the plume has penetrated and left behind a thinned crust. So this topographic profile is in clear contrast with what we saw earlier. I will show one video of this exact model. We've already know what we're gonna have a look at, so that's easier in terms of looking at these fast-moving videos. This is a short video, and important to note is that the time steps in this video are not constantly the same. Actually, the time steps increase, so the temporal intuition is not so it's not so straightforward, but I just want to show what we dynamically see. And I'm going to show this video twice, and I would recommend to first have a look at the composition and then the second time have a look at what's happening at the surface in terms of topography. So it's a short video, and I will start it now. Basically, you see the plume rising, and at the margins, you see several episodes of dripping material, after which the plume completely cools down. Now I will play it again, and I will comment on the surface topography. Basically, we have a high surface, high corona interior that loses elevation, and the outer trench is completely inverted into an outer rim. And this white dot is just a visualization artifact. So this was our reference model, but obviously we changed quite some parameters. And I'm going to show you two more models that show also quite some interesting behavior. One of those models involves a slightly stronger lithosphere and a thinner crust. And this model is relatively similar, but has one key difference, and that is basically that a stronger lithosphere makes the lithosphere to behave more rigidly. So as the plume penetrates the lithosphere and pushes it apart, instead of lithosphere dripping at the plume margin, actually the rigid lithosphere creates a stronger slab that will retreat, radially retreats outward. And after a certain amount of time, this circular slab breaks off, still because apparently the material is not strong enough to sustain really a long-lived subduction zone. So instead, we have a short period of retreating subduction at the plume margins. And then, just like the model we have looked at before, ultimately the plume cools down and the topography is completely inverted. Then finally, I will show a very different model that involves a weak mantle plume, which basically we made the temperature excess of this plume much less or much lower than our reference model, and also a strong lithosphere. And what happens in this model is, here you can look at the left side, this plume is able to rise a little bit, but is not buoyant enough to break the strong lithosphere apart. Instead, it spreads laterally under it, here shown in the middle. And even when it cools down, it doesn't have much interaction with the crust. And the corona, or the topographic profile at the surface, is very different than what we've seen before. Actually, throughout the period of this model evolution, we have an elevated dome or plateau that only slightly loses its elevation. So yeah, there were, in all of our models, we found a lot of different interesting plume-lithosphere interactions, of which I just shown a few. And we also identified the key parameters that influence these different kind of plume-lithosphere interactions and the different corona structures at the surface. And that we illustrated in the graph that is that will be shown here. Basically, on the vertical axis, we plot the buoyancy ratio. And the buoyancy ratio is basically the ratio of plume buoyancy over the lithospheric strength. And for the mathematical expression, you can have a look here. What this indicates is when we have a very buoyant plume, it could be a very hot plume or a very large plume in our models, and or a weak lithosphere, our models are plotted at the top of this graph. Alternatively, if we have weak mantle plumes in combination with a very strong lithosphere, our models plot at the bottom of this graph. And then on the horizontal axis, I've actually illustrated two things. Basically, the scaled crustal thickness was proven to be a key parameter. This is the thickness of the crust divided by the thickness of the lithosphere. And this is actually representative by the MOHO temperature. And basically, if this ratio is close to 1, we have a very thick crust, a thick warm crust, and a thin weak lithosphere. And here on the left, we have a thin cold crust and a thick strong lithosphere. And we've plotted all of our numerical models in this region, in this parameter space. And every circle here is one of our numerical models, and the different colors indicate the different types of plume lithosphere interactions that we identified. So you can see 4 different colors. So there are indeed 4 different dynamic regimes that I will just quickly go through. So on the top right here, we have buoyant mantle plumes, but also relatively warm crusts. And all models that plot in this field show a mantle plume that penetrates the lithosphere, pushes it outward, and at the plume margin, you have a lithospheric dripping going on because the crust is relatively weak and warm. And this was basically our reference model that we had to look at just a few minutes ago. And on the top right, we have the second type of model that we've looked at, being that on the top right, we still have a very buoyant mantle plume, but here the crust is colder and the lithosphere is stronger, so it creates this retreating subduction episode. And I want to emphasize that in all of the models, this subduction is only short-lived, but it could happen in several pulses. We saw quite some interesting dynamics going on here. So this was the second model we had to look at. Then in this lower kind of left region, there are only 2 models because, well, the other models showed much more dynamic behavior, but these 2 models showed an underplating mantle plume, which is the last model we had to look at. And that's also because the buoyancy ratio is low, and also the MOHO temperatures are cold, the lithosphere is strong, so the mantle plume does not penetrate the lithosphere at all. And then finally, we identified one regime that I have not shown you, and I will not talk in great detail, but you can have a look at the paper or ask me about it. This is kind of a transitional regime in which the mantle plume partially, it reaches the crust and partially penetrates to the lithosphere, but not as dynamic and not fully like the upper 2 regimes. Yeah, so this is the 4th type of behavior we identified. And all of these behaviors also resulted in relatively different corona structures at the surface. So that was very interesting. And our key models that we then evaluated in more detail are, most of our models were plotted here below. So these 2 regimes are lithospheric dripping regimes and our short-lived subduction regimes. So what I'm going to show you now is the temporal evolution of topography of the corona of these models. And these are just 2 representative models that we had to look at earlier. Basically, what you see here is a plot. On the vertical axis, you have the radial position on the corona. And this means that 0 is kind of in the center of the circular corona. And then as you go outwards, you go in both directions. This is in kilometers. And what is plotted in color is then the topography of that profile. And this profile is averaged over like the whole circular region of the corona. And on the horizontal axis, you see time. So this is the topography of each corona over time. So this is, again, just some snapshots of models we've seen earlier. Basically, in these early stages of model evolution, you have this buoyant mantle plume that causes a very, very elevated interior. And the bending of the lithosphere and downgoing suction of downgoing material causes a deep trench to be located right on top of it. And then, so this is really illustrated in this left part of this graph and also here in the smaller region. And then as time progresses, you can see that this topographic profile is completely inverted into the opposite. We have an outer rim surrounding an interior depression. And as I mentioned before, but this is very important, these elevated rims that ultimately arise are located right above the region where material has broken off and where crust is thickened. And the depressed interior is always located above this area, where a very thin crust is left behind after the plume has cooled down. So these are 2 very opposite topographic states. And I highlighted this once more here. So we really have a topographic inversion, which kind of indicates that we have this active stage, which is very, very has a very specific signature, and this inactive stage, which also has a very significant signature in terms of topography at the surface. So the key points of our 3D models were that the morphology of corona is really related to what processes are going on underneath it, all these different types of plume-lithosphere interactions that we've seen. But most importantly, the crustal thickness variations eventually lead to an isostasy-driven topographic inversion, which means that we have this circular trench surrounding an interior high, which is inverted into an outer rim surrounding an interior depression. And this indicates that the topographic pattern of corona is maybe indicative for plume activity or activity of plume-lithosphere interactions. So this was the end of my master thesis, but we've had some quite interesting discussions at AGU, and I had a talk with both Laurent and Taras, and we really thought about, okay, what can we do with this outcome, this numerical study outcome? Can we then apply this to actual data on Venus, or can we say something interesting about what's actually going on there? This made us come to the idea to address the current state of plume activity at large corona on Venus by looking at the topographic structure. So this will lead to the next part of our research, being this corona classification. Basically, what we did, we evaluated the possibility of present-day plume activity on Venus by analyzing the surface topography of large corona. And for this, we used the topography dataset of the Magellan mission and the USGS nomenclature of the corona, like the largest existing database of corona on Venus. And the plume activity classification is based on the results that I've just shown. And basically what we do, we labeled a corona as currently active if it features an outer trench and an outer rise. And we mark a corona as currently inactive if it has this evident outer rim and inner depression. And we also, obviously, if features were ambiguous or uncertain, we classified them as unclassified. So I'll just give a few examples of individual corona structures. So this is the Thoris corona, of which I already showed an image before. And this here on the right is the data set that we have in terms of its topography with the highest resolution possible. And even though there's something interesting maybe going on here, the overall topographic signature is clearly an elevated exterior surrounding an inner depression. And these are all features that we mark as fossil corona stages. So such an corona we would identify as currently being above an inactive mantle plume, like plume-lithosphere interaction going on there. In contrast, for example, when we have a look at this mighty corona, it features a lot more detailed topographic structures. And basically, it has this kind of rim around which there is a trench and again an outer rise. And these are features that are consistent with still ongoing plume-lithosphere activity. So such a corona we would mark as being still active, being in a state that predates the final topographic isostatic inversion. I also just wanted to show here on the left side, you see the Artemis corona. I have no image of it, but this is just a topographic database. And the Artemis corona is, a massive structure. It's about 2,000 kilometers wide. And it shows a lot of tectonic features. But here in this small image, you mainly see on the southeastern part, you see this clear deep trench surrounding an elevated interior and a very high outer rise. And here on the right-hand side, this was just a comparison with one of our models that one of the models had a very large mantle plume, and we identified some similarities between the two structures. And this Artemis corona has also been already studied before, and it has been suggested that there is quite some activity going on this side. And also, according to our classification, this corona is, at least in this edge, currently still showing tectonic activity. So we've done such an individual analysis for 133 corona on the surface of Venus, and which led to the following outcome that is plotted here. So I've just plotted the locations of the corona that were identified as active or as inactive. And importantly, this database we have made freely available online in the supplementary data of our paper, but also on the Zenodo file. And basically, 37 of our analyzed corona express structures that are consistent with ongoing activity. And most of these corona are clustered here in the Themis region, also here in this part of the Latticephera or Alpha, and a little bit here on this region in the Aphroditera. And also here a bit in the Isla region, we have quite some active hotspots. And most importantly is that these results present new evidence for a really recent tectonic and magmatic activity on Venus. And this complements other identifications of such activity. So the key points of my talk, we ran 3D numerical models of corona formation, and the morphology of corona seems to be really related to what processes are going on underneath it. And the topographic patterns of corona may be indicative for plume activity. This led us to reveal 37 locations on Venus whose structures, and these corona structures are consistent with ongoing plume activity on the planet. And this is new evidence for widespread plume activity on Venus. So it's not so geologically dead as originally assumed. And just as a last note, there are many directions to go in, obviously. But what I find very interesting is how such a global distribution would reflect circulation patterns of the deep interior of Venus, as I'm mainly working on deep mantle convection during my PhD. So with that, I have finished my talk, and I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
So we have Rich Walker.
Can I unmute myself? Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay, thanks for a great talk. That was really interesting. I've got kind of two questions. The first one being the amount of volcanic activity that's associated with corona. Is that something that we have a handle on? Is there a lot of volcanic activity, no volcanic activity, or don't we know?
Do you mean by volcanic activity, present day volcanic activity, or in general?
I'll take present day or past.
Okay. We know to a certain, like every corona is associated with volcanic activity as just generally, not necessarily saying it's now or past. They see basically radar imagery provides the most data for this. You can see individual lava flows in these images. And the main question is whether this is recent or past, and indeed how much this is. I must say I'm not too familiar with the exact line of thought. I'm not a planetary geologist, but it is like from what I've learned is that every corona is really associated with volcanic activity. Just how much is the question, and obviously these radar images date from over 25 years back. So I think this is still remains debatable, and I think people should figure it out, hopefully with some new data sometime.
Okay, second question, is this a potential, something equivalent to a corona, a possible model for crustal recycling in early Earth history? Are corona likely to have been present at some stage in Earth history? I guess there's a other way of phrasing the question.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Something I didn't mention, but Venus is generally thought of as a very good case study for the early Earth, when temperatures inside the Earth were much hotter, before we had continental material, perhaps. So these kind of models could very be like this, especially this kind of dripping behavior of the lithosphere and this short-lived subduction episodes. In my opinion, this is definitely something that could have been happening on Earth before we actually had a solid plate tectonic behavior. The only thing I want to mention is I think so on Venus, the surface temperatures are very high, which also in our models obviously causes a relatively viscous behavior of our material. And I think on Earth, even though interior temperatures were much hotter back in the days, I think the surface temperature has not changed that, or people think that the surface temperature has not been that much higher in Archean times. So I still think there might be some dynamic differences, but I definitely think that these kind of plume-lithosphere interaction, although I focus really on Venus, could be also telling us a lot about what might have happened before we had this more rigid behavior of the lithosphere and the onset of plate tectonics. So yeah, I think it's a good case study.
Thank you. And then we have Laurie. After that, we have Ball and then Mohan. So Laurie, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for a really great talk and congratulations on this great paper.
Thanks.
I did want to go off of Rich's question a little bit about if maybe this ever happened on Earth. I know there's these like Archean and Paleoproterozoic dome and keel structures on Earth. They're like found in some of the greenstone belts. I don't know very much about them, but that's sort of like the first thing that popped in my mind when you were showing some of your figures. It might be interesting to sort of look at those as an analog. I don't have any idea if those are associated with plume behavior or could be, but that's like the only surface feature on Earth that maybe reminded me of those structures. So anyway, but that wasn't my question. My question is, I don't really totally understand the thickening of the crust where the trench used to be. Is that thickening due to like mechanically pushing crust together? Like when the plume pushes it out, it gets thickened because it's mechanically being pushed? Or is it thickening because of actual volcanic activity adding to it around the plume head?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. Something indeed I didn't emphasize a lot. So I'm trying to just find an image because it will be better to illustrate it. So I will start sharing my screen again. Here. So we're just back like, okay, yeah, I can do full screen. That's always a bit nicer to look at. So that's a very good question. So this thickened crust, like if you look at the right part, so that's this this area basically. In most of the model, like in most of our models at least, this thickened crust is really caused by kind of more mechanically. This material has indeed been pushed aside, and then the break off of this material doesn't happen like horizontally. This break off actually happens kind of well, vertically or has an angle to it, and what is left behind is then this thickened region. So this is, in at least how I understand my models, more a mechanical thing, as there's not that much crustal material added on top of it, although it could. So I just go to our more subduction model. Here it's a bit more like a bit less clear because just the crust is so thin. So here I think it's a combination of both. We still have kind of this down dipping configuration that is kind of born out of this break off that's not happening directly at the surface, but at a lower at the deeper, greater depth. But here you do see that then on top there is like some crustal material added. But I would argue, just based on the models, it's more mechanically than volcanic. Yeah.
Thank you. I have more questions, but maybe I'll email you because other people have questions.
Great. Yeah, it would be, especially like the Earth analogs. Like I haven't focused on it in my study, but like I've presented this work now a few times, and there were definitely some interesting comments about that. So I'd be happy to talk about it.
Okay, next we have Bao.
All right, thanks for a great talk, Anna. I will probably also email you with a number of questions later.
Awesome.
But the one that is kind of popping out at me right now is the slide that you showed toward the end with the results of your classification across the surface. And what's really interesting to me is the apparent hemispheric distribution of the active coronae that you've determined in this classification scheme that you've developed. And it's okay if you don't have an answer for this. I don't know if there is one or if it's possible, but do you think that this could translate down to some inferences about the thermal or thermochemical structure of Venusian mantle and how that might change throughout time, like say through secular cooling? Because that would be an interesting early Earth analog.
Yeah, thanks for your question. I think that's indeed something I've hinted at with like just my one sentence outlook, also because I'm now working on global mantle convection. That's something I'm very interested in. So yeah, how this reflects deep circulation is definitely something to look into. I actually, there is Scott King and Grant Uyen, two scientists also in the US are working on that right now. But I do want to emphasize something, and I will share my screen again. I hope this doesn't bother you. So this is a slide I didn't show, but this is from our paper. This is actually like the same figure I've shown before, but then in gray you have all the data that we couldn't classify, because I mean, in reality, these corona structures are not as perfectly symmetric or as perfectly simple, but also the data we have is very outdated and has a very coarse resolution. So some of these corona, you cannot even look at their topographic signature. So there should be new missions to Venus. But so like, there definitely seems to be this hemispherical distinction, but I mean, corona is just one of the structures that could indicate plume activity. Of course, I think for a really better understanding, you should also include kind of other data sets or other structures that could also be caused by upwellings. For example, there are these stars here. Those are actually some locations that previous literature has also proposed to host active volcanism and magnetism based on different methods. So yeah, I think definitely the mantle circulation thing, it could really represent some interesting things going on in the deep interior of the planet, but we should do this with care, because these corona, this is also a part of the corona only, and then part of them were also ambiguous. So yeah, it should be done with care, but it is an interesting avenue. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Care is wise in this case, but what kind of looks really interesting here is it's a little reminiscent of how plumes on Earth tend to be closely spatially associated with LLSVPs. So that's something we can talk about more.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, we have Mong Hong.
Hi, it was a great talk, and thank you for giving us this talk. I have two questions. So the first one, you mentioned there are sort of two members where you have the dripping versus the subduction. I was and then you say for those two groups, it's not just the density contrast between mantle and crust, there's also crustal thickness. So I was wondering if you guys have quantify or classify different groups and then look at the crustal thickness and then see if there's a correlation. And then my second question is about, you mentioned this lateral pushing. So I was wondering if the crust was cold enough, then you may have expected thrust sheets around the rim. And then I was wondering if you see that from the satellite data. Thank you.
Okay. I just want to check whether I got your first question correctly. Is your question related to our models or related to crustal thickness on Venus, perhaps? Now
on Venus.
Yeah.
From those like 37 active Coronae
exactly.
structure.
So
yeah.
This is a good point. Like, I mean, I guess you like multiple people have suggested like, okay, so all these active regions, are we able to distinguish or like be able to say whether there's subduction going on there or let's say dripping? And indeed, that is dependent on the lithosphere structure and the crustal thickness. The only problem I have with applying this to data or to Venus is, first of all, like we have been able to clearly define like a clear boundary between subduction and dripping. But this is a combination of the lithospheric thickness and the crustal thickness. So this is not purely like, we cannot say, okay, crustal thickness of 30 kilometers marks the change between these two behaviors. So that's one slight problem we have. And then secondly, I don't have them here, but we do not know, like you could also argue this other way around. What if you know the crustal thickness, can you then propose what's happening there? But crustal thickness, our knowledge of crustal thickness on Venus is pretty poor. I mean, there is a global, there are some global maps. I'm not sure Laurent knows more about this. There are various studies which provide crustal thickness maps, but if you would then compare them with one another, they are massively different. So that's very, very hard to know about Venus. And then the second part about perhaps having some trusting at the sides of the corona. So this is not something we see in our models, just because of the resolution of our models. In our models, like we have really big structures, and our resolution is relatively coarse to really identify individual fractures. We do know the stress field, and it seems to be consistent, but we cannot identify individual fractures. For that, higher resolution models are needed.
Yeah, but I mean from the data. I mean from the satellite data.
From the data. This is not something I've looked at. I'm not sure, but people at those rims, people mainly, well, Laurel can correct me if I'm wrong, but there are structures that are people infer as being compressional, but really trust sheets, I'm not sure actually.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, if I can jump in on this, it is usually
quite
a bit harder to see the compressive feature than the tensional ones in these radar images. So, you know, fold belts and stuff like this would be harder to identify. They have seen some of them locally. Grabens and cracks are much more prominent in most cases, so that is a question. But occasionally, like there's a debate, for example, that edge of Artemis, whether or not it's having like compression or like extension. There's something which is sometimes interpreted as a fold belt there. And even in Aromaity that, and I showed in some detail, there's some parts in the Northwest that have things that look like folds. So maybe not thrust sheet in the sense that, but folding certainly happens.
Okay, we have one last question from Nick Schmer.
Hey, Anna, that was a really great talk. I had a question for you about if we were to return to Venus with a new radar system like Magellan, do you think that there's enough deformation that's happened in the 25 plus years since that we might be able to see these changes?
That I'm not too sure of, actually. So at least in our study, active still doesn't mean right now. Like our active period in our models is less than a few millions of years. So this means geologically active or geologically today, but not actually right now. Like these plume-lithosphere interactions, it doesn't mean there are eruptions going on right now. This is also something that the media kind of interpreted a bit different sometimes from our studies, saying that, oh my God, there are active eruptions right now on these locations. Well, they're active plume-lithosphere interactions, and this could mean that eruptions happened right now. It could also mean that eruptions have happened a million years ago. And I think most of the previous, I've shown a few papers which are saying individual lava flows are very recent, but also in those papers, recent means within the last few million years. So I'm not sure if you would see anything changing in 25 years. It will be cool.
How about like just you know, like the equivalent of plate motion on Earth, right? If you have some subduction process going on at the edges of one of these guys, would you expect to see like what we would see here on Earth, like plate deformation, like maybe something we could do with synthetic aperture radar or something like that in SAR?
That's a good question. I think to a certain extent, yes, but this lithosphere and crust on Venus is so much more viscous that we cannot, like, I don't think it's a one-on-one analog to what we see right now at subduction interfaces here on Earth. Yeah, that's all I know about it at the moment. But
Okay.
it would be, yeah, it would be nice to look at.
Cool. That's all I had. Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the interesting talk and so many questions
Thanks
from
again.
the audience. I'm so glad to have this. If you have more questions and want to know more about Anna, please check the website that I sent out along with the bio when I forward the seminar information in the email. And
Right.
see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.